Yeah.
Wouldn't it be amazing if we started an event early? So about a minute or two, but it looks like we have such a great number of you here. Thank you so much for making the time to be here for this event. I would like to welcome you all in the name of G. Marcus Cole, the Joseph A. Madsen Dean and Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School, and the interim co-directors of the Law School's Religious Liberty Initiative, Nicole Garnett, the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School, and Rick Garnett. More on him anon. The current director, Professor Stephanie Hall Barclay, is clerking for the Supreme Court. I am Paul Carey, a senior visiting research fellow of the Religious Liberty Initiative. Welcome. Thank you. Established in 2020, Notre Dame Law School's Religious Liberty Initiative promotes religious freedom for people of all faiths through scholarship, events, and the law school's Religious Liberty Clinic. We are here to discuss Professor Michael Breidenbach's new book, Our Dear Bought Liberty, Catholic and Religious Toleration in Early America. John T. McGreevy, the Francis A. Tyranny Professor of History at Notre Dame, has said of Professor Breidenbach's book, you can read this on the Harvard University Press webpage, unequivocally excellent, one of the most important recent books in modern Catholic history, clearly argued, brilliantly researched, important in its implications. Breidenbach's book convincingly lays out how the Reformed Catholic or conciliar Catholic tradition, deeply Catholic but resolutely opposed to any papal interference in temporal politics, shaped the American idea of religious liberty. We needed our dear-bought liberty, unquote. We've also distributed copies of Notre Dame law professor Jerry Bradley's Claremont review of Professor Breidenbach's book. I see that it looks like most of you have that. Unfortunately, as you can see by our Zoom screen here, Professor Breidenbach was left stranded in Florida yesterday, along with thousands of others, when his flight and many, many others, I'm told up to 4,000, were canceled abruptly. We are grateful, however, that he will be able to join us via Zoom. So thank you, and thank you at short notice, Professor Breidenbach, for being able to switch media and formats. I also want to thank Nick Munson, the Religious Liberty Initiative's intern, who really has been on his feet yesterday to make sure that we could do this. Thank you, Nick.
Good man.
We want to also show our gratitude and truly thank our co-sponsors, the Law School's program on Church, State, and Society, directed by Rick Garnett, the Paul J. Shiro Fort Howard Corporation Professor of Law and concurrent Professor of Political Science. He directs that center, and we're grateful for them. We also wish to thank our co-sponsor of this event, the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, directed by Vincent Philip Munoz, who is the Tocqueville Associate Professor of Political Science and concurrent Associate Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame. And I would like to acknowledge his presence here with us. Thank you, Professor Munoz, for this co-sponsorship. Just to note, especially for Professor Breidenbach, we were to have had Dr. Gabrielle Girgis, postdoctoral teaching fellow of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, moderate the question and answer portion of this discussion. Unfortunately, she was taken ill over the weekend, but Michael, she sends her regards and she remembers you fondly for the course you taught her in her first year at Princeton. And so she says hello. Stephen McDaniel, a visiting assistant professor of law at the Notre Dame Law School, will introduce Professor Breidenbach, and we're grateful that he's been able to do this for us. He joined Notre Dame recently in the fall of 2021. He recently concluded a clerkship with Judge Jose Cabranes of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Prior to his clerkship, Professor McDaniel worked for Jones Day in the Labor and Employment Department and at Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett in the Litigation Department. Professor McDaniel earned his JD from New York University Law School, an MA in Political Science from the University of Pennsylvania, and an AD in Religion from Princeton University. Professor McDaniel.
Thanks very much, Paul, and good afternoon. In the early 17th century Sussex, a pious but deeply unwise Puritan couple called Bull named their daughter Fly Fornication. As farmers will tell you, bulls cannot generally be persuaded to fly fornication, and young Fornication Bull, the cruder and less religious members of the county nicknamed her, was no exception. She entered the criminal records of her county in 1646 for acting at variance with her given name with the cheerful assistance of one Nathaniel Huggett. Call me a romantic, but I hope the relationship between these partners in crime ended in marriage and a daughter named Redemption. This anecdote has nothing to do with our conversation today. I mention it only because Professor Breidenbach's current project is a history of naming in early America. And I want to drum up interest in inviting him back to discuss it. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Breidenbach. He's Associate Professor and Chair of History at Ave Maria University and Senior Affiliate for Legal Studies at the Program for Research on Religion, Urban Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests concern the history of political, legal, and religious thought, especially in early America and the Atlantic world. In addition to the subject of this event, our dear bought liberty, Catholics and religious toleration in early America, Professor Breidenbach is an author of History of Religious Liberty and Church-State Relations. The Cambridge Companion to the First Amendment and Religious Liberty. And in addition to his articles in academic journals and volumes, he has written for publications such as The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and First Thing. Here we are at a thoroughly Catholic law school that is thoroughly, heroically dedicated to religious liberty. Professor Breidenbach's book reminds us, however, that no society can safely pursue its ends without adopting the political principle of loyalty before liberty. The application of this principle, of course, poses a problem for the liberal theory of our constitutional order. Under that order, according to Justice Robert Jackson, no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. But it also poses a challenge to Catholics, who, unlike some Christians, believe that the church is inherently and by divine institution an organized social body, called and empowered to govern itself in time and space. For Catholics, then, there is nothing easy or obvious about drawing distinctions between temporal and spiritual, or civil and ecclesiastical authority. Easy or not, however, such distinctions must be drawn in practice by Catholics throughout history, in political settings ranging from savage persecution to complacent Catholic establishments. Today, Professor Breidenbach, in his book, Professor Breidenbach argues that during the Revolutionary era, many Catholics of the Anglo-American world who did mean to be good Catholics found in the tradition of conciliarism the concepts that allowed them to pledge undivided civil loyalty to the civil power without betraying their faith. This gave them standing to make a full-throated claim to religious liberty that contributed importantly to the American tradition of separating church and state. I, for one, have my reservations about some of the religious arguments on which these American Catholics relied, but I confess that it is something of a revelation to me that specifically religious arguments had any great weight with them at all. We are all indebted to Professor Breidenbach for unveiling, as it seems to me, a new part of the intellectual landscape of colonial and revolutionary America, and for doing it in very clean and engaging prose. I look forward to hearing much more from him on this subject and any other that catches his eye. With that, over to Professor Breidenbach.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan, for that very generous introduction and helpful summary of the book and some of its implications. You've made my job today introducing the book so much easier. I also want to thank Dr. Paul Carey for his great help in organizing this event. And I'd like to echo all the thanks that he gave to the sponsor of this event, the Religious Liberty Initiative, its co-sponsors and the directors therein, and all those people who made this event possible. I have to say there are worse places to be stranded in than Southwest Florida, but I'm terribly sorry I wasn't able to be with you in person. I was very much looking forward to being back on campus at Notre Dame and meeting so many of you. So thank you very much for coming, despite my being beamed in instead of with you live. Well, as an historian, I like to begin with stories. So let me tell you a story. a group of religious minorities immigrant to America to flee from religious persecution. They hold their faith dear and oppose any papal interference in their civil affairs. These pilgrims establish a small colony in the New World. Later, they fight for American independence. They help to codify a constitution that guarantees religious liberty and other freedoms we enjoy today. This is, I think, one of the standard stories of the American founding. And so far, that story has largely been told with Protestant characters. Today, I'd like to swap that typical cast of characters. I'd like to tell you a story in which Catholics are the founders and framers of that story. It's a history of how these Catholics negotiated their dual allegiances that Stephan outlined for us in a country that was hostile to their faith. And it's a story of how these Catholics contributed uniquely to American religious liberty. Now, presenting the story this way challenges, I think, much of what we think we know about Catholics in early America. After all, in England and its colonies, Catholics were presumed dangerous until proven loyal. It was illegal for Catholics to attend Mass openly. It was a crime to be a Catholic priest, and some were even killed, or at least hunted to be killed, for being priests. Catholic parents could not send their children to Catholic schools. Catholics were prevented from serving in public office. So in short, Catholics remained legal outlaws in their own country. And yet by the late 18th century, American Catholics had signed the Declaration of Independence. They had helped frame the Constitution. They had finalized its First Amendment. And even a Jesuit priest became the first Catholic bishop in the United States. So what explains this remarkable transformation? How did Catholics go from being suspected subjects to trusted citizens? My central argument in the book is that Catholics became American by declaring independence from the Pope. These Catholics rejected two beliefs that had made Catholicism politically intolerable. First, they denied that the Pope had spiritual and moral infallibility teaching. And second, they denied that the Pope can intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries. This included the right to depose civil rulers and even annul civil laws. Now, I know many of you know that John Locke had argued that such papalist positions, in his letter concerning toleration, require Catholics to pledge ultimate allegiance to not their king, but to the Pope. Locke saw this position as a dangerous subversion of sovereignty that, simply put, cannot be tolerated. What is not known is that many Catholics agreed with Locke and denied these doctrines of papalism. These Catholics articulated ideas from the conciliarist tradition. More on that later. This tradition was rooted in Catholic thought and was compatible with republicanism as we find it in the American founding. The Catholics who upheld this tradition were some of the most important Catholics in early America, from the founders of Maryland to the framers of the US Constitution. Now, I know some of you in the audience, especially those who are Catholic, may find their stance to be provocative, even scandalous. After all, 150 years ago, at the First Vatican Council, the Catholic Church declared papal infallibility to be dogma, and thereby consigned conciliarism to an ash heap of heresy. Yet by declaring themselves no papist Catholics, these reformers had understood their position to express what they considered the true faith, uncorrupted by papal pretensions. They presented a Catholic tradition that advocated temporal independence and a juridical separation of church and state. Catholics of this sort were not a foil to American religious and political arrangements, as many of the political pamphlets and cartoons of the era would have it. Instead, they fit their beliefs within the Republican tradition of the American founding and answered Protestant charges that Catholics should be legally penalized. Once considered lawbreakers, These Catholics became lawmakers. The remarkable story of early American Catholics challenges some of the most deeply rooted assumptions about American religious liberty and church-state separation. As mentioned, one of the prevailing accounts of American religious liberty is based on Lockean principles. But as already mentioned, Locke had denied toleration to Catholics, even Catholics who denied papal authority in civil affairs. He judged such Catholics as having a false faith. Another account argues that the extension of religious liberty to Catholics was a one-sided process in which liberal or enlightened Protestants and deists deigned to grant Catholics a kind of consolation prize in exchange for American and French Catholic support during the Revolutionary War. Now, I think these factors were certainly part of the reason for the extension of religious rights to Catholics, but it's not a sufficient explanation, because behind the many sources for American religious liberty remained one underlying principle: loyalty before liberty. In other words, you don't get your liberty until you pledge your loyalty. And American founders had little reason to exclude Catholics from religious and civil liberties, at least at the federal level, since, as the Catholic Bishop John Carroll noted in 1790, the American founders were, quote, perfectly acquainted with the maxims of the Catholics. And the reason why Catholics could pledge uncompromised civil allegiance to the United States is because of their adherence to conciliarist principles. So let me pause a moment to explain a little bit more about conciliarism before I introduce you to some of these Catholics. According to the conciliarist tradition, the Pope is not infallible, and he does not have the authority to intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries. Catholics held these positions not because of any particular hostility towards a special pope or a set of popes, although they certainly had their grievances, or out of repugnance to the Pope as holding the chair of St. Peter. Nor were their denials sweetened simply by expediency, motivated merely by a desperate desire for survival in an anti-Catholic culture. Instead, these Catholics criticized what they call the papal usurpations of civil and episcopal jurisdictions. For these arguments, the conciliarist tradition offered their most vibrant and venerable expression. And this tradition was forged in the medieval crises of church and state, when popes and kings vied for temporal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction, and when multiple people asserted the same right to the papal chair. That's the schism of the Middle Ages. The conciliarist tradition offered a distinctive view of how the church should be governed, who should govern it, and what authority its leaders held. So if I could encapsulate conciliarism for you very succinctly, it would be first, the Pope is a magistrate elected by the church's representatives, the cardinals, and thereby limited in his spiritual jurisdiction by the authority of not just the cardinals, but all the bishops, and susceptible to doctrinal error. Second, the Pope could therefore be reprimanded or even deposed by his fellow bishops in a general council. I hope you can hear the echoes of a kind of proto-republican theory here. And finally, they believed that the Pope's spiritual authority was held in such a way that he could not touch the rightful temporal authority of other sovereigns in other countries. So for English and American Catholics, this conciliarist tradition was pervasive and persuasive. It had been distilled through the Gallican Church in France and had been reiterated and reconceptualized in an Anglophone context. And so they distilled from this tradition the double denial of papal authority that served their own particular aims in a political and religious context very different from the Middle Ages. So who were these important Catholics? My book covers the history from around the founding of Maryland to the First Amendment and the establishment of the first diocese in the United States. So this afternoon, I'd like to highlight several figures who are important to this story. The first is George Calvert, who secured the king's permission to establish the colony of Maryland. Then there's George's son, Cecil Calvert, who founded Maryland's laws. And at the American founding, we moved to Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, as well as his second cousin, Daniel Carroll, a US congressman. And finally, there's the aforementioned John Carroll, the first Catholic bishop in the United States. And in discussing these figures, I hope to show that first, Catholics had an important contribution to the founding of America. Second, I want to show how American Catholics helped shape religious liberty in America. And finally, how their story forms the American Catholic identity that we know today. So let's turn to our first figure in our first PowerPoint slide, George Calvert, known as the first Lord Baltimore. Now, George Calvert set an incredible goal to establish a colony that welcomed Catholics within a Protestant empire that had distrusted Catholics. To understand that difficulty, let's look at the central test of loyalty for Catholics at the time. This was called the Oath of Allegiance. Now, this oath was meant to ensure that one was loyal to the English king. But the king believed that to ensure this loyalty to himself, his subjects needed to deny several things about papal authority. They had to deny that the Pope could depose the king, that the Pope could authorize subjects to harm the king, and that the Pope could absolve oaths to the king. In response to this 1606 Oath of Allegiance, Pope Paul V charged that any Catholic who swore such an oath would be automatically excommunicated from the Catholic Church. So Catholics were presented with two bad options: consider potential traitors or face excommunication. So how did George Calvert respond to this? This afternoon, I want to present new archival evidence of a revised Oath of Allegiance drafted by George Calvert himself. Calvert's revised oath shows that he resolved the problem by claiming that papal authority presented no problem to his allegiance to the king. Before we look at his revisions, I want to just touch on Calvert's life a bit more closely. George Calvert was an ambitious social climber. Born to Yorkshire tenant farmers in 1580, he had earned his undergraduate degree at Trinity College, Oxford, then studied law and immersed himself in civil service. He eventually became a member of Parliament and the King's Privy Council, and finally, King James's first Secretary of State. This is effectively the top civil position in England at the time. And he was able to do this legally because he had been forced to conform to the Church of England despite being initially baptized and raised a Catholic. Now framed by the curled curtains in cardinal red shown here, Calvert would, in just a few months after this portrait was painted, reveal the decisive act of his political career, his reversion to Catholicism. The decision to become a Catholic again would present a singular challenge for this royalist advisor in Protestant England. And when the new king, Charles I, insisted that Calvert swear the Oath of Allegiance, Calvert refused, thereby forfeiting his career at court. Now, this was a devastating moment in George Calvert's life, because for a civil servant of unstinting loyalties to the king and country, the decision to refuse this oath had presented a crisis of commitments. To paraphrase, could a Catholic remain the king's good servant? Calvert had refused to swear the oath, presumably because he did not want to face excommunication in a church that he had just rejoined. But the king did not punish him, at least not beyond the loss of a job. And instead, his previous service to the king allowed Calvert to gain two colonies in the New World. The first colony was Avalon in modern-day Newfoundland, and the second, more famous colony was Maryland. Now, let me pause for a moment to speak about Avalon, because in Avalon, Calvert allowed Catholics and Protestants to worship freely. This experiment of allowing settlers to profess their religion openly proved as challenging as it was unique, though. One Protestant vicar there informed the King's Council that Calvert and his family attended Mass. He also alleged that Calvert had a couple Protestant couple's child baptized Catholic without their consent. I think this was calumny. Yet Calvert's loyalty to the king shielded him from any further punishment. Catholics too were appalled at Calvert's toleration of what they called heretics in Avalon. Calvert even offered his own house for Protestant religious services, which was against the practice of the Catholic Church at the time. Nevertheless, Calvert offered his Protestant settlers the liberty and protection to worship according to their own consciences. But the attempts at creating a harmonious, religiously diverse colony were simply overshadowed by the practical realities of a harsh colonial life. Remember, this is Canada. That harsh winter had hastened the deaths of most of his settlers and persuaded Calvert to seek a warmer climate. So he sailed to Virginia. Now, Virginia required all settlers to take the oath of allegiance, just like the king required. Calvert again refused, but this time he was prepared with a revised oath. The Virginia officials who received Calvert's new oath had enclosed it in their letter back to London, but its contents in the British Library have been lost until now. I found actually Calvert's revised oath in a different London archive. And before we investigate Calvert's revised oath, we need to understand what the original oath of allegiance mandated. So if we could just put up on the screen Calvert's oath of allegiance that I found in the archive, that manuscript there, just so we have a sense of what these dusty documents that historians grapple with looks like. Now, the original 1606 oath required the oath taker to swear several clauses, and Calvert revised 2 of them. This is what those 2 original clauses said. Go to the next slide, please, of a transcription of the original oath. First, the Pope does not have the authority to depose the king. And second, it is a heretical and damnable doctrine that princes which be excommunicated by the Pope may be deposed or murdered by their subjects. So we click to the next slide, we'll see Calvert's first change to that oath. There are 2 important changes here to mention. The first is that Calvert removed any mention of the Pope's deposition power. This removal did not imply that Calvert believed that the Pope had the power to depose princes. He did not believe it was true. On the contrary, I found in the archives and other writings that he disavowed any interference by the Pope or any Catholic bishop in the king's affairs. Instead, I interpret the removal of that clause simply to mean that he wanted to leave the matter in a kind of legal limbo since it was so controversial in Rome. Let's look at the second change in Calvert's oath. Calvert removed the word heretical from the clause concerning the deposition or murder of kings by their subjects. Now, I think the elimination of the word heretical was significant because to swear this doctrine heretical was to indicate that the Pope had taught heresy. Now, clearly, Calvert did not believe in the doctrine. After all, his oath renounces it. But he also did not want to be in the awkward position of calling the Pope a heretic. So here again, we see Calvert being very sensitive to the concerns of the Holy See, but nonetheless siding with the spirit of the king's oath. And so if we take this together, the clauses in Calvert's revised oath reveal significant insights into how he attempted to resolve the problem of dual loyalties as English and as Catholic. First, he did not believe the Pope had the power to intervene in the temporal affairs of England, as Cardinal Bellarmine had argued in that 1606 Oath of Allegiance controversy. But he also believed that if he wanted any chance of pleasing both Rome and London, he would have to cut out that clause altogether to leave it in a kind of holy ambiguity. Second, he was careful not to call the Pope's teachings heretical, but he still declared it false to believe that subjects could lawfully depose or murder an excommunicated king. Well, the compromise that this lawyer made in Virginia didn't work. The Virginia authorities didn't think that they had the authority to accept a new oath that the king had not authorized himself. So Calvert went back to London and obtained permission for a new colony called Maryland in honor of Henrietta Maria, the Catholic wife of King Charles I. And Calvert was ready to begin his new colony, but died 5 weeks later before the final seal was set on the Royal Charter of Maryland. Despite this, George Calvert had shown how English Catholics could be loyal subjects of the king. He had also attempted to create a colony where Protestants and Catholics could live under a regime of religious toleration. And this legacy continued with the settlement of Maryland under George Calvert's son, Cecil Calvert. So we'll turn to his portrait now. Under Cecil's leadership, hundreds of English passengers finally boarded the Ark and the Dove to sail the Atlantic in the hope of reaching the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. Their motivations for immigrating were many. To be sure, the financial prospects of the New World remained an important incentive, but they also sought greater civil and religious liberty. And during their months at sea, the Protestants and Catholics on board lived very close together, despite the legal separation they faced under English law. And as the ships left England, Cecil instructed that Catholics should exercise their religion, quote, as privately as may be, and treat the Protestants with as much mildness and favor as justice will permit. After the 4 months at sea, Catholics and Protestants anchored at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and in Thanksgiving, Jesuit priest Andrew White celebrated the first Mass in what would be British North America, while the new Protestant settlers attended their own religious service. To us, this sounds like a typical Sunday in America, people going to their respective religious services. But Cecil Calvert was embarking on an audacious endeavor, like his father, bringing Protestants and Catholics together peacefully, each respecting each other's religion and right to worship. Needless to say, there were many objections to this Maryland experiment, and one of the main obstacles remained that oath of allegiance. Now, Cecil Calvert had instructed his officials to minister an oath of allegiance to all the settlers. And in doing so, Cecil had apparently conformed to English law that required settlers to pledge allegiance to the king before they went on board the ship. Yet Cecil had not specified what oath should be used. He had not written the oath of allegiance, which would have unambiguously referred to that original 1606 oath, but simply mandated an oath. Now, the next official mention of Maryland's oath was almost 5 years later, when the Maryland Assembly passed the Act for Swearing Allegiance. The new oath avoided all the controversial parts of the original English oath, did not mention the Pope, deposing power, excommunication, or murder. Instead, it focused on the temporal allegiance to the king. But I found again in the London archive that he had in fact drafted an oath that received the attention of the Holy See and papal nuncios, that this oath, like his father had done, retained the original clauses that the Pope does not have the power to depose the king and that the subjects do not have the power to murder their temporal sovereign. In short, Cecil rejected the view that the Pope had the power to intervene in temporal affairs. And this denial was a prerequisite for Catholics to gain religious toleration in England and the colonies. They had to pledge their loyalty to the king before they received their liberty. This was a very important development in the history of American religious liberty. Cecil Calvert's solution was to decouple political membership from religious belief. Civil loyalty would be shown not by pledging for or against certain doctrines, but by a simple oath to the political authority. And this solution was later articulated in the US Constitution. To hold public office, you would have to only swear to uphold the Constitution. You wouldn't have to swear a particular set of religious doctrines. American politicians seek votes, not vows. So Cecil Calvert's other major intervention was drafting what became the Act Concerning Toleration of 1649. So we'll turn to that document now. The Maryland Toleration Act was the first comprehensive, systematic law in English history that ensured religious toleration for all Christians. With this act, Calvert had not settled the problem of religious difference theologically, that is, by catechizing or converting those in disagreement, but politically. Religious differences could remain, or even intensify as long as civil peace was maintained. According to the Act, all people professing to believe in Jesus Christ shall not be, quote, troubled, molested, or discountenanced for or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof, nor any way compelled to the belief or exercise of any other religion against his or her consent. Cecil Calvert's government did not establish any particular church. Instead, according to Calvert, the final end of government was not to help his subjects get to heaven by a prescribed path of salvation, but simply to create the conditions for civil peace and for that religious liberty to flourish. This juridical separation of church and state would become a hallmark of American religious liberty, and his legacy was an inspiration for later American founders. James Wilson, for example, acknowledged the debt to Calvert in his first law lecture in 1790, addressed to President George Washington, Vice President John Adams, and both houses of Congress. Wilson said, quote, "The doctrine of toleration in matters of religion has not been long known or acknowledged. For its reception and establishment, the world has been thought to owe much to the inestimable writings of the celebrated Locke. But while immortal honors are bestowed on the name and character of Locke, why should an ungracious silence be observed with regard to the name and character of Cecil Calvert? Let it be known that before the doctrine of toleration was published in Europe, the practice of it was established in Maryland as early as 1649. James Wilson concluded, remember, with George Washington in the audience, quote, "Calvert was truly the father of his country." Now, early American Catholics were especially indebted to the Calvert legacy. And the most important among them was the Carroll family. So let's look at Charles Carroll of Carrollton, of his portrait that he commissioned for himself by the same portrait artist that would later paint the future King George III, no less. Like all Maryland Catholics, the Carrolls were prohibited from holding public office, attending public mass, sending their children to Catholic schools. And that's why Charles Carroll of Carrollton, along with his second cousin, John Carroll, traveled to Europe at the age of 11 for his Catholic education. They both attended a Jesuit school, and one of the recent discoveries in that school's archives is a poem that Charles Carroll wrote at the age of 16. Let's look at that poem now. In this poem, Carroll defends the free exercise of religion in the face of state tyranny. It's written as a dialogue between the Roman governor, Almachius, and Saint Cecilia. Almachius demands that Saint Cecilia conform to the Roman pagan religion. He presents himself as a benevolent ruler who only wants the best for her. He counsels her to, quote, amend, while it is allowed, amend these reckless decisions, to remain a Christian and refuse the state religion. He says, instead of untimely death, live longest, live happy and blessed for you and yours. Worship the gods with your lips, Christ's Godhead in your mind. Pretend to be pious. This pretense will give you life. The subtext here is that Almachius is the British state that requires Catholics to conform to the Church of England. And some Catholics had indeed chosen to present themselves as members of the Church of England, even though they continued to believe the Catholic Church secretly. Carroll's poem shows how unholy this compromise was and how such laws against Catholics were unjust and created the conditions for that hypocrisy. Carroll would again challenge these laws against Catholics during the American Revolution. The Revolution presented him a new opportunity to show Catholic loyalty and establish religious liberty for Catholics. And one of the most important ways that he showed his loyalty was by signing the Declaration of Independence. So we'll put up the famous historically inaccurate painting of that moment. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the only Catholic to sign that declaration. But what did it mean for a Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence? Well, let's look at the phrase free and independent states. What does that mean? Well, the exact phrase can be found in Vital's Law of Nations, published in 1758, a book that the Continental Congress had referred to during its international disputes. Vital defined a free and independent state as one that governs itself without dependence on any foreign power. Vital's theory of sovereignty shaped Americans' own understanding of how independent states should be free from all foreign independence, including that of the Pope. In fact, Vital specifically mentions papalism in his Law of Nations as dangerous to an independent nation, since the power of a foreign court rendered the civil ruler but half a sovereign. Fact, quote, capable of overturning a state. So the problem here is imperium in imperio, a state within a state. That's the problem with papalism. So according to the logic of Vital's theory and the Declaration of Independence that implicitly quotes it, the free and independent United States was not under any temporal authority of any foreign power. So by signing that declaration, Charles Carroll was not only denying Britain's rule over America, he was also denying the Pope's power over America, just as the Calverts had argued a century earlier. And this again was that central argument. The Pope has spiritual authority, but not the kind of spiritual authority that affects temporal authorities of the temporal authority of other countries. And this position in particular allowed Catholics to answer the charge that they were disloyal because of their allegiance to the Pope. Now, Charles Carroll also went on to craft religious liberty laws. He was one of the principal drafters of the Maryland Constitution, which afforded full religious liberty and banned religious tests for public office for Christians. He later expanded it to include Jews as well later in his life. He intended in a letter for that to happen. With these and many other acts, including fighting in the American Revolution, Catholics showed that they could be indeed loyal citizens. And because of the no religious test clause of the US Constitution, Catholics would go on to serve in federal office. In particular, Charles Carroll and his second cousin Daniel Carroll helped shape the First Amendment as members of the First Federal Congress. So we'll look at Daniel Carroll's portrait now. When James Madison proposed his first draft of what would become the First Amendment, Daniel Carroll was the only congressman to support that measure explicitly and unapologetically. In his speech in Congress on August 15th, Carroll maintained that the amendment merely articulated what was the general sentiment concerning the right to religious liberty. In the Congressional Register, he was reported as saying, quote, if you can put that on the screen, facsimile of that Congressional Register. Mr. Carroll, as the rights of conscience are in their nature of peculiar delicacy and will little bear the gentlest touch of the governmental hand, and as many sects have concurred in opinion that they are not well secured under the present Constitution, referring to, I think, the Anti-Federalists here, he said he was much in favor of adopting the words. He thought it would tend more towards conciliating the minds of the people to the government than almost any other amendment he had heard proposed. He would not contend with the gentleman about phraseology. I suppose a lot of originalists would snicker at this phrase. His object was to secure the substance in such a manner as to satisfy the wishes of the honest part of the community. Now, there's something interesting about the way in which Carroll's remarks were recorded. They here are elevated to a kind of oratory when you compare them with the statements recorded by other congressmen. And one clue as to why Daniel Carroll's remark received such pride of place in this Congressional Register is that almost all of what we know about these congressional debates, including the First Amendment, comes from a reporter named Thomas Lloyd. And Lloyd, it turns out, was Catholic. Indeed, he had studied at that same European Jesuit college where Daniel Carroll had attended, where Charles Carroll attended, where Bishop John Carroll had attended, and who had taught Thomas Lloyd. So we have two Catholics helping to pass the First Amendment in the First Federal Congress, and another writing its first history. Well, 1789 was an extraordinary year for Catholics. Not only had they helped to shape the First Amendment, but they also received their first bishop. And here is John Carroll for his portrait as, by this time, Archbishop, that now hangs in the Georgetown University Library. A few months after the First Amendment was finalized, the Pope confirmed that John Carroll would be America's first Catholic bishop. John Carroll had written to a cardinal in Rome that America's ecclesiastical revolution was, quote, more extraordinary than our political one. What was so revolutionary about American church-state relations? Well, most countries had an established church, especially in Europe, and they did not always grant religious liberty, at least the way as articulated in the First Amendment. But the First Amendment had prohibited a federal established church, a church of the United States, if you will, and had guaranteed religious liberty, again, at least at the federal level. A few years earlier, the Pope had even requested that Congress officially approve Carroll as a Catholic ecclesiastical superior in the United States. Not quite a bishop at that point, but with some of the bishop powers. Congress replied that while it respected the sovereign and state of the Holy See, Congress held no, quote, jurisdiction and powers in, quote, purely spiritual matters, such as electing a Catholic ecclesiastical leader. Congress therefore claimed, quote, no authority to permit or refuse the Holy See's request. This, I take it, is the first unequivocal statement by American Congress on church-state relations. And it happened to be the context here of appointing a Catholic ecclesiastical leader. Now, Carroll's own thinking reflected this legal separation of church and state. Bishop Carroll maintained that the Pope's, quote, power or prerogative should not clash, quote, in the least degree with the duty we owe to our country or its laws. He assured his fellow American Catholics that there was no incompatibility in being a citizen of the United States, to which, quote, we owe allegiance, unquote, and obeying, quote, the vicar of Christ, to whom we owe obedience in things purely spiritual, not temporal. And he penned two pamphlets anonymously, arguing that nothing in Catholic teaching prevented Catholics from serving in public office. In other words, whatever dogma lives loudly within Catholics, it does not prevent them from serving their country honorably. So let me conclude. I've shown that Catholics were important figures in early American history and that they helped shape religious liberty laws and practices in America. This story has also formed how American Catholics understand their dual identities today. Ever since the story that I've told, Catholics have consistently maintained that their religion does not pose a problem for their duties as American citizens. A long line of Catholic bishops and Catholic politicians, including Bishop England and Ireland in the 19th century, Catholic politicians in the 20th century like Al Smith and John F. Kennedy, have made these same arguments. And while there are current debates about the compatibility of one's Catholicism and one's particular political commitments, evidenced by the controversy surrounding our second Catholic president, few today question at a general level the compatibility of their American and Catholic identities. That compatibility can be found in the architecture of Baltimore's Basilica. In the early 19th century, Bishop Carroll commissioned English architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe to create the first Catholic cathedral in the United States. And Latrobe came back with two designs. One design that you'll see on the screen here was a neo-Roman style. The style was consistent with that of the US Capitol, which, as it turned out, Latrobe had redesigned himself, and which had been built on land donated by Carroll's relative. Latrobe's preferred proposal, on the other hand, presented a Gothic form for the cathedral. And you can see the Gothic form here. Latrobe thought that that design, this Gothic or Neo-Gothic design, was more appropriate for a Catholic church. Carroll and his trustees, however, selected a revised version of Latrobe's Neo-Roman design. And so you can see the modern Baltimore Basilica on the final slide there. Now, Carroll's choice was not an aesthetic judgment against Gothic architecture. In fact, in his journal on his grand tour of Europe, he said he quite preferred the Gothic and the Baroque architecture. Rather, his choice for the Roman style was an indication of how the Catholic Church should present itself to those beyond its walls, a choice, I would submit, that continues to shape American Catholicism today. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions. I'm here. Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
We have questions. We also have copies of your books that are for students afterwards. If you would like to come up and have a complimentary copy of Professor Breidenbach's book, we've got a few more than this here. We're very happy to give you those. That is the Religious Liberty Initiative. I'd like to sponsor them for you. So as far as questions, I know that we had a couple of questions put in from students, and I think from the Religious Liberty Initiative students themselves. If you're here and you would like to ask those in person, we'd like to hear from students first of all. Yes. Now, can you hear? He's going to ask the question. If you can't hear, I'll repeat it into the microphone.
Sure, thank you.
Hi, so I'm Josh DeFoss. I'm a second-year law student, and I'm part of the Religious Liberty Initiative this year. So Pope Gregory XVI denounced religious freedom as leading to, quote, indifferentism towards truth, stating, quote, this shameful font of indifferentism gives rise to that absurd and erroneous proposition which claims that liberty of conscience must be maintained for everyone. For Gregory, religious liberty led to in his view, false conclusion that one religion is as good as any other. To what extent was this then Catholic notion of religious liberty, which clearly contradicted the American founding narrative of religious freedom, the reason for some of those American attitudes towards Catholicism in the founding era?
I think I got all of that. If I could summarize the question just to make sure that I got the essence of it. We have Pope Gregory disclaiming religious liberty as a kind of religious indifferentism, that all religions should be treated equally, even though Catholics know, he says, that it is the one true faith. And all others fall short from it in some way. How does that square, in other words, with the religious liberty that these American Catholics supported? Is that essentially what you're asking? Dr. Carey, maybe?
Yes, he said yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes. He said yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. I think that's a great question, and it points to the way in which this Calvert and Carroll legacy plays out in the 19th and 20th centuries. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was not only the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, he was the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, dying at the age in his 90s in the 1830s. And it just so happens that around the time that he died, Pope Gregory issues Morari Vos and other encyclicals that, as you mentioned, really challenge this Carroll legacy. And one strategy or move that one could make, and this is made, I think, by most American Catholic scholars who want to pair the American religious liberty tradition with Catholic magisterial teaching, is to say that this Pope and later popes simply didn't understand to the full extent what kind of religious liberty laws and practices obtained in the United States. And so they usually historicize this by saying when Gregory and Pius and Leo XIII and so on are talking about the shortcomings or worse of religious liberty laws, what they have in mind is something found in Europe, right? Particularly France in the 19th century, after the French Revolution, the rise of the secular state, the nation state in Europe. I'm sympathetic to part of that kind of argument. At the same time, especially because in my own archival research, the Holy See, especially in the beginning, is really trying to figure out what kind of church-state arrangement America has, calling the United States the United Provinces of America. They just don't have a good sort of baseline to think about this new regime. And they're actually taken by surprise when John Carroll writes to them in reporting on the success of Catholicism in America. So I think there is a translation problem there. I also think that popes mostly are thinking about Europe. Having said that, part of this has to do with whether you think the First Amendment, for instance, is a kind of metaphysical document or can't help but be something of a metaphysical document or having some kind of metaphysical basis, or rather see it as John Courtney Maury did, merely in articles of peace, right? This is just a kind of legal compromise here, practical, that doesn't really get to a kind of philosophy. So one way to answer the question is simply to say, on a metaphysical basis, right, at the very highest levels of theology and philosophy, there either is or is not one true faith. And if there is one true faith, then all the other religions sort of somehow fall short of this. And if government is in the business of picking sides on this issue, and I think Gregory and other popes in the 19th century think that they should, if possible, then they should choose the one true faith and not give the same sort of legal status to all others. If you think that government has a different role to play here, though, then the calculation changes. And for the American Catholics at the time, they just didn't think it was the role of government. In fact, they basically deny Thomas Aquinas's de regno here, that the end of government is ultimately the salvation of souls. They just deny that sort of picture, sort of philosophical picture of what the state is. And if that's the case, then this is a kind of legal compromise or some kind of practical solution for what had been previously in Europe an intractable problem. So it's not a terribly simple answer, but it affects, basically what I'm saying is it depends on at what level of analysis you're looking at the question. If you're looking at a purely philosophical or metaphysical stance on church-state relations, then absolutely I think they're in conflict to what Pope Gregory is saying. If you see the American founders as doing something different, though, soon at the level of a kind of practical solution, then it may not be compatible. And I think, just to conclude on this question, Leo XIII, I think, offers a helpful two-part analysis in Immortale Dei. In Immortale Dei, he says unequivocally that the proper orientation of church and state should be that of a kind of hylomorphic union of soul-body. But he also says, by way of, I think, qualification later in that encyclical, that if it's not possible in that polity for a variety of reasons, I think mostly the sociological fact of pluralism, then one should not instantiate, an established church, and the ruler should do the best the ruler can in terms of creating civil peace, which would, of course, afford some religious liberty to all. Now, whether that means that you can't privilege a certain religion over others is another question. But I think there is a way in which states can privilege one religion over the other, but still afford religious liberty as a kind of minimal basis as a human right to all.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. This was really informative. I'm specifically struck by Cecil Calvert's role in developing the modern view of American religious liberty. Could you talk about why he's not emphasized today in modern history, or I don't want to say forgotten, clearly you haven't forgotten, but why has his role been downplayed as far as the formation, both on the Catholic and American sides of his doctrine?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think the answers are a few. Number one, Catholics don't fit into the standard story that I outlined in the beginning of the lecture. It's largely been a Protestant or deist story. And so what I've done though is fit these Catholics into that standard story, just swap the characters. They fit at some level quite nicely. And so as a Catholic, he doesn't fit into that largely Protestant story. The second is that as academics, at least, we tend to privilege those who write systematic treatises and those who have long, lengthy works and voluminous corpus from which to draw political theories and thoughts. And Calvert and frankly, Charles Carroll and any of these other figures don't have that, that volume. I must say though, Charles Carroll and John Carroll have quite a lot of correspondences that have been diligently edited to a very high degree. And Charles Carroll of Carrollton's correspondence will be published, the last 3 volumes will be published in a few years, I hope. But these are not systematic works. And so we, I think, instinctively draw on those like John Locke and others who have, these systematic treatises at their disposal. So in other words, it takes a lot of work as an intellectual historian to piece together the various fragments that the past has left behind in order to give an account of that. And the third reason is that Cecil Calvert's experiment, from one point of view, failed. The Act Concerning Toleration of 1649 was conceived in a time of great turmoil in Maryland. This is around the time of the English Civil War. And that fractious and confessionally conflicted war found its way into Maryland as well. And so there were huge problems that the second Lord Baltimore had to face in Maryland against Protestants who had always contrived to find ways to see him as sort of Spanish aligned or somehow unloyal to the English crown. And so one of the ways you can read the Act Concerning Toleration is not just a point about the regime of toleration, but as a way of suing for peace during the English Civil War. And the problem, of course, is that the Calverts lose their hold on the proprietary of Maryland, and it is overtaken by Protestants. And later, Lords Baltimore convert to the Church of England. And so, basically by the Revolution of 1688, that toleration regime has ended for Catholics. So there's a kind of short window in which Catholics show this toleration regime to work, but it's very, very small indeed.
Questions? Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, Professor. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to get a free copy of your book because it's been in my Amazon wish list since I saw it reviewed in person. So I guess I can delete it from there now.
You can buy a copy and give it to someone else.
Touche. I'm wondering about the particular, especially on the Establishment Clause side, the particular, what these Catholics at the time of the founding had in mind. You talk about a sort of minimalist reading of the Establishment Clause, stuff about, the state can't have a role in appointing bishops. Of course, that's something that the church was muddier maybe then. I don't know exactly when it changed. It was at least muddier in the Middle Ages, but now would sort of agree with, except maybe in the case of China. Anyway, yeah, I'm wondering what exactly they had in mind. I think particularly that Maryland Article of Toleration starts with something that would, the part that you actually showed on the slide would quite clearly be an Establishment Clause violation. Now it's against a law against blaspheming against the Holy Trinity. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what the founders what based on your research, what you think the founders had in mind, especially these Catholic framers of the First Amendment had in mind when they were talking about an establishment of religion.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for your interest in the book. On the question of the Act Concerning Toleration, or the so-called Maryland Toleration Act, Judge Michael McConnell has called that act one of the first, or the first, hate crimes legislation in early America, for precisely the reason that you suggest. Terms like Jesuitical, or just Jesuit or Roundhead, any kind of name that has a politically charged connotation, or used in a reproachful way, like the Virgin Mary or the Lord's name in vain, would be subject to a fine and later penalties. It sort of escalated after that. And so it's not totally against free speech, but it, you know, it does have these kind of restrictions. It also says that anyone sort of working on the Sabbath without necessity, subject to a fine. And so there are ways in which, and the Sabbath here is Sunday. So there are ways in which we can see this as, you know, in modern jurisprudence, I think, violating a certain interpretation of the Establishment Clause. You have to remember, though, that this is, if you see this as a legislation for civil peace, this was meant to sort of wear away some of the confessional and political edges during a civil war. And so the main goal here is to be commodious and harmonious as much as possible during this difficult period of English history, and therefore Maryland history. But at the same time, the Maryland Toleration Act gives no pretensions that it's establishing the Church of England, or for that matter, any church, including or especially the Catholic Church. And so we do find, at least in a kind of institutional sense, a non-establishment. And this goes to your question about the First Amendment itself. You know, I'm drawing on our good friend, Dr. Donald Drakeman, whose wonderful work on church-state relations has influenced, you know, many scholars, including me, that, you know, a good minimal reading, at least, of the Establishment Clause is that it denies a church to the United States. Now, I want to suggest maybe adding to this, okay, what is a church of the United States? What does that look like? And, you know, Dr. Drakeman's answer is it's sort of analogous to what the Church of England looks like. And if you look at the whole history of what's called jus patronatus, the rights of patronage, which had been practiced by Catholics in the first instance and then picked up by Protestants, what you have here are at least 4 rights that had been granted by ecclesiastical leaders, including the Pope himself. And one of those is to nominate ecclesiastical leaders, which up until quite recently had been done in the Catholic Church, including in the 20th century. And what I see the American Congress doing in 1783, before the First Amendment, of course, is to deny this right of patronage, this particular right that civil governments had been using, whether it's in England or in France, 2 different religious political cultures, but the same sort of idea. And so that's denied. And I think that's a helpful addition to our understanding when we put it in a kind of intellectual history context to see what the First Amendment might mean here. That goes beyond the text, of course, written by Thomas Lloyd, this Catholic. So I think that's helpful because it shows a kind of, as Rick Arnett would see it, a kind of libertas ecclesiae, right? The freedom of the church here for the church to govern its internal affairs. And we see this played out politically and practically right after the Louisiana Purchase. You know, the United States just gained a bunch of formerly Catholic French territory, which included Ursuline nun convents and schools. And the Ursuline nuns petitioned Thomas Jefferson and Congress to ask them what is going to happen to our land and our institution. Because before it was under a charter by the king himself. What happens to that? They think they have to ask Congress to renew their charter. Or the president to renew their charter. And Thomas Jefferson replies that they're free to move about the country. and that they will not be at all interfered with. They're doing good charitable work, and so on. So that's the sort of move that the United States makes that I think is distinctive, and I think you can see this borne out in by the time we get to presidents like Jefferson and the Secretary of State like James Madison, when they're thinking about what the Establishment Clause might allow for in these new territories, formerly Catholic territories.
So I know that there are other questions. We'll have to stop here. However, yesterday, Professor Breidenbach told me while we were trying to reroute him a little bit, he said that if anyone would like to follow up, he's very happy to have you contact him. You just look him up on the Ave Maria website, History Department, as was said in the introduction by Stefan McDaniel. He is a chair there, and so simply write to him. Let's thank the Professor Breidenbach for the time here.
Thank you.
So you were richly filled on that. I certainly was and learned tremendously. Thank you for placing some context of intellectual history. Now, for those students, if you'd like to come up and receive a complimentary copy, please do. I'm sorry that Professor Breidenbach is not here to sign the book, but he's here at least with us and give us substance.
Thank you again.